And Bryan Fischer here with D1 Ticker and D1 Extra. Happy to be joined by the NCAA Secretary, Rules Editor, and National Coordinator of Officials, Steve Shaw. Steve, thanks for joining us. And I'm sure it was a fantastic couple of weeks that you've had because you got to see a lot of your fellow officials in person. Could you talk to us a little bit about the meeting you guys had at the NFF Foundation headquarters there in Dallas with a lot of your peers?
We did. So we had all the Division I coordinators, the coordinators from FBS and FCS all together. And really, since the pandemic started in March of 2020, we've been all virtual. So this was the first time everybody was back in the room together. And the meeting really, CFO, college football officiating, the goal of our group is to kind of keep ourselves together, same rules interpretations, same mechanics, same philosophies. It's such a national game today. We have to do that. And so that's one of the things, how we can work together to be better together. And then certainly we talk about rule changes or anything that's impacting officiating or really our game in general.
When you do have those discussions, what was kind of the prevailing sentiment coming out of that room? Because you have all 23 conferences out of D1. I'm sure there's a little bit of a difference between what the focus is at the FBS level versus the FCS level, and maybe some different concerns as well.
Yeah, there's always different type of issues there, but really there's a trend going on in our game, and that is really linking conferences together. An example is the Big Ten and the MAC work as a partnership in officiating, and then even into FCS with the Missouri Valley. And then, that's very similar to the SEC and Sun Belt working together and then working with the Southern. So we're seeing these partnerships emerge, and that's really good because now we can develop officials along the way, give them the same training, the same evaluation process. And so that's really been a good thing. And part of having everybody together, how can we develop officials together? How can we recruit new officials? And how do we work clinics together? So even though, there's always great competition between conferences, the coordinators work together very well for the betterment of officiating. And so that's really what we get out of there. What policies, what kind of programs? We have a recruiting committee. What kind of things can we do? And we're really excited because we're hopeful. Nobody knows what this pandemic does next. I wish I knew. We thought we knew a couple of times, but we don't. But we're really planning toward a spring that gets us back toward normalcy, where we're going to have face-to-face clinics, camps where we can all work together and see officials working on the field. So that's our planning right now. We're very hopeful to hold there. Ultimately, COVID will dictate that, but we're planning for the first time in a while to kind of go back to a face-to-face mode.
It's interesting you mentioned that those camps and whatnot, which obviously was a tremendous part of an official's off season, just kind of keeping those muscles alive. Did the pandemic, maybe just because everything was so virtual, so siloed off, when you're meeting on the road or whatnot, did it almost kind of stunt some growth for some officials, and do you have to play a little bit of catch up?
Well, we do. Really, from a development standpoint, I think that one of the things that we have really worked hard on are developmental clinics where we're looking at minority officials and that sort of thing. And to put those on hold, it didn't stop the development. We really tried to learn how much can you do from a virtual standpoint, but there's always an advantage to having that official on site, and especially to have a on-field experience with people observing them and giving them feedback and critique. So we're hopeful to kind of keep the learnings of the pandemic from a virtual standpoint, but then overlay that back with kind of a face-to-face and on-field components. And I think that will help spark opportunity for officials. And especially, we have a terrific focus around developing. It's not just going finding a minority official, but it's finding them early enough and developing them along the way, give them opportunities. And so that's kind of what we had a little miss in this window, and we'll put back into overdrive as we kind of get out of it.
You mentioned the development process, and it's been interesting. Obviously, you see, if you look around the NFL, right, there are a lot of familiar names and faces from the college game that have kind of gone up to the pro level. What is the development process like from your standpoint for referees coming in nowadays? Because I'm sure it's a lot different from how it was 15, 20 years ago when you started out in high school and then you kind of worked your way up to the FCS ranks and on. What is different about development of officials now versus, say, 5, 10 years ago?
Well, there are really two big areas. Number one is the camps and clinics. I always advise a young official, get a mentor that can help you navigate through which clinics do you need to go to? Can you get involved in scrimmages? I mean, the best thing you can do, as a coordinator, I'd get letters from governors and pastors and, all type people. And those are always good from a character standpoint. But if you want to know how official really works, go ask their peers, go ask the people that work on the field with them. And so that's the first thing I would say is, get opportunities that get you on the field where you can work with other officials. And then, now video is so prevalent. You can get video of not only training tapes and that sort of thing. We do that. CFO, we have, like, during the season, I have a weekly training tape that's a national training tape that we put out. And so there's so much video you can do to learn and improve, but also video on yourself working. There's a video available in every one of your games. Go get it, evaluate it, do your self scout, if you will. That's an area that you can really use to improve yourself as an official.
It is a rules year, so there are going to be some tweaks and some changes, and I know that's obviously a hot button topic for officials, for fans, for coaches, for even the fans out there in particular. And I'm sure you hear a lot about the targeting rule from the fans in particular about what is the future of the targeting, how can tweaks be made. I know a lot of coaches, maybe less so this past year, but that's been a point of emphasis for them, especially guys getting kicked out of the game. Where are we with the targeting penalty, and do we anticipate any potential tweaks to how it's interpreted or enforced?
Well, that will be a huge discussion in our rules committee. But remember this, that the targeting rule, I mean, the basis of it is a player safety rule. And the player behavior change that we've driven through targeting is really good. And so I know fans sometimes get out there and just think, targeting is so pervasive, but if you go back and look at the stats from this year, we averaged 0.20 targeting fouls enforced per game. That means one targeting foul in every 5 games. You'd never convince a fan of that. They think there's 1 or 2 in every game. So the coaches and the players have really, the rule itself has helped drive this player behavior change. We only had 7 players in all of FBS get 2 targeting fouls during the season, which I think is very, very positive, because once you get your first, now the rule itself drives you to, hey, make sure, let's look at your technique. Let's make sure we do that. So we'll have a big conversation about the penalty phase of that. But I think the rule itself is driving the player behavior we want. And if we do make a change, we want to make sure that it continues to drive that proper player behavior. I mean, we're fighting for the health of our game, for the health of our student athletes. And we have to work to take the head out of the game. Keep your head up, see what you hit. That is so important. And so this will continue to be a big topic in our rules committee, a lot of discussion on the penalty phase. But as a rule, it's not going away. And, the NFL has a similar type rule, with head hits. But they have some things like fining players that we don't really have as an option. And we found out that, if you want to get a player's attention, playing time is the number one thing. Just think about, we were having helmets coming off at an alarming rate. And we made a change where now you miss one play if your helmet comes off, and that's made a significant difference. So that's the most important commodity to a player, and that's what gains their attention. So we'll talk about it and see if there are ways to even enhance the player modifications and player behavior. But we have to do the things to protect our student athletes, and targeting has helped us with that.
Work closely with David Shaw. I know he's been one of the coaches out there that have talked quite a bit about feigning injuries and faking injuries to slow down offenses, it being a bit of an issue in the game. I know there's been a lot of talk about what can we do. Is there a appropriate penalty to even have something to apply to that? What are the discussions like coming out of your meetings in Dallas and kind of going forward into your March meetings about fake injuries and slowing the game down and ultimately how that can be stopped and how it could be addressed?
Well, first of all, this is an integrity issue. I mean, if you feign an injury, that's gaining an unmerited timeout for your team, and that's kind of not what our game is focused around. And so this has been a big topic, a big issue, and we've made kind of incremental steps over the last couple years. 2 years ago, we made it a big point of emphasis with AFCA, the coaches group, and then last year we actually put another step in place where you could appeal a situation where if you felt like your opponent was feigning an injury, you could appeal that to the national coordinator, and then we'd look at it. If we saw that there might have been merit there, there's no set penalty, but we would go back, have conversation with that athletic director, and it would be up to that athletic director to do anything with that they felt appropriate within their institution. We felt like that was step two, and we really don't think that helps solve the equation here. So I think that the rules committee will be very strongly, we've got to go to step three. What step three is, we don't know, and we'll have a lot of conversation about that. What we've talked about is increasing the time, that a player has to stay out after an injury. And so, there are a lot of issues with that. There are a lot of pitfalls. So, the intent will be, I really believe the rules committee will not just step back and say, well, we've done everything we can do. We'll go to phase three, just not sure what that's going to be yet. But this is something that, especially as our game evolves. I mean, now with the up tempo, teams are going fast. They make a first down. They're hustling to the line, and the defenses get in a bind. And that's what creates this window of feigning injuries. And so, it's a combination of coaches have to set the environment with their team that we're not going to tolerate this. And then we need to look at the rules. Are there ways that we can avoid putting players in that situation where they have to do that? But it's a difficult one, but ultimately boils down to an integrity part of the game. And that's why we'll take it so seriously and talk it through. And I think we've got to make progress here in this.
Going up tempo, I'm sure there's a lot of folks that would love to have the games themselves go a little bit more up tempo and get shortened. I know there's been a lot of discussion about running the clock after first downs and instead of how it's currently constructed. Where are we at with in terms of the length of the games, number of plays? I know that's been something that's discussed nationally quite a bit, but is this a potential for a change with the rules this year?
Well, it will be another big topic in our committee. We're going to have a full chalk of topics in our committee, but we pivoted a little bit for a while, everybody talked about the length of the game, how long it was taking. And so this past year, we averaged 3 hours and 19 minutes in an FBS game. And that's not that bad, but a troubling number is a little over 20%, 20.4% of our games are going over 3.5 hours. And so that's been a big topic, but we're going to pivot a little bit away from just the time in the game and go back and take a look at the number of plays in a game and the student athlete exposures. I mean, that's a player health and safety issue. And so we're really now trying to get some data, what are the number of plays that have, gone up over the years? What do those numbers look like? And that's not easy numbers to come up with. You'd think that'd be easy, but people count plays in a game so differently. Some, a lot of times the stats are, this team ran X number of plays in a game. And then you can get both teams, but that doesn't include the special teams plays, which are plays. We have issues where if you have a penalty play and you repeat the down, well, that may not be counted in some databases. So we've got to get a database that we can make consistent analysts on over the time. But we need to see really over a window, what about the number of plays in the game, which is a student athlete exposure. And I think that's what we'll focus on. And we've done a lot around the game to kind of, without taking plays out, what are the ways we can do to keep the game moving? And we've done about everything we can do. We've gone to a 40-second play clock after a touchdown and after a kickoff. We've gone to these TV timeout clocks that now when that thing hits 0, we whistle it back in play. We've gotten the officials a lot more efficient now in restarting the clock like after a first down. So we've taken all the edges and we've whittled everything away. And now I think we're going to have to look at, a rules change potentially, and whether it'll be this year or over time. But there are really two things that are on the table. You mentioned one, what about stopping the clock after a first down? Maybe we only do that in the last 2 minutes of the half. But I'm not really sure how much that's going to garner for us, because if you watch the games, our referees have got really efficient in getting this clock restarted after a first down. So, you look at how many total first downs in a game, do you pick up 5 or 6 seconds on each one of those? So you can kind of see that kind of time. I think the other area we'll look at, it used to be that runs out of bounds stopped the clock and it started on the snap. But we made a change in the rule where now if you run out of bounds, the clock stops. But once the ball is down and ready for play, the officials have stepped away and they're in position, then we restart the clock. And so there's been some debate, because our game has, subtly changed from, 10, 15 years ago, a running game to now a passing game. And many times you see these long games, a lot of incomplete passes. So similar type scenario where if you had an incomplete pass, then once the ball was set, ready, officials step away, then you could restart the clock. The offense could maintain control of the pace. So if they didn't want to lose a play in the game, be there, be on the ball when we wind the clock, snap it and go. But that's an area that we may look at as well. And that may have a bigger impact, not only in speeding the game up, but actually number of plays, because some of these games with up tempo and a lot of incomplete passes, that creates not only a long game, but a lot of plays for these players to play.
Talking with some coaches, I know that especially because the crossover between the NFL and college football has been a lot less nowadays between guys moving up and back down at different levels. Something that's been brought up quite a bit is helmet communication. I know the NCAA's allowed some test runs, I guess you could say, for that. Where are we with helmet communication? Is that something that's at least in the near future and being discussed quite regularly? Is that a change we could also see?
Well, between all the technology discussions that we have, that is the one that I think coaches as a group firmly agree. Coach to player communication is something that they would very much like to have. And we actually did a test in a game this past year, the Bayou Classic. Many of you may be familiar with that game, and we tested it. And very good results. So it is not the idea of the technology. What is still a big part of that is the helmet itself and ensuring that the safety of that helmet when you introduce communication devices. How do you test? Who's going to test? Is it still going to be the NOCSI standard, or do we have to have more standards? The advantage we had in that one game is both teams were using the same helmet manufacturer, and there were a limited number of helmets that we were able to, fit with the communications information. So we were able to kind of get through the helmet safety part of that. But that's probably the long part of this process. Even though we'd all love to do it very quickly, we've got to make sure that we don't introduce something in the helmet that could create an issue for the player, and to make sure that we maintain all the certifications, et cetera, from the manufacturers. That's so important. So that's probably the long pole in the tent to get that done. But I think that's something that the coaches and what we've seen, it's a very positive change.
You mentioned the player safety aspect, which obviously is taken on a pretty great, much more importance these last couple of years. And I'm curious, coming out of the pandemic, from your perspective, with talking with other officials, I would imagine last year in 2020 was a little bit different because of the protocols and everybody having to deal with things that were, kind of out of their control. And I'm sure it was much more of a normal season in 2021. How much have you noticed in terms of the mental health of officials kind of going back from that first pandemic season to last year, and hopefully as we move forward into 2022, how much are you dealing with kind of the mental health aspect with your officials?
Well, that's a great question, because what we saw in 2020, I mean, our officials were testing every week. and the protocols we had in place, they were never together. I mean, they checked into their hotel room on a Friday night for a Saturday game, but they didn't go to dinner together. Their Friday night meetings was all done either Zoom or Microsoft Teams virtually. Their pregame conference on Saturday was all virtual. The only time they saw one another was when they got in the van to go to the stadium. And then as soon as the game's over, they're back in their hotel rooms, all on Zoom doing their post game. And what we found out very quickly was that, it's that human interaction, that opportunity to, have breakfast on early Saturday morning with your crew that kind of keeps you going throughout the year. And we kind of lost that in the pandemic year. That's the first time I've ever heard officials really say, man, I'll be glad when this season's over. I just can't wait to the finish line of this year. And so this year, this is not a political statement, but, we had two sets of protocols. One, if you're fully vaccinated, and one, if you're not fully vaccinated. And so that really helped push a lot of our officials to get fully vaccinated. And that really helped us kind of get back to some form of normalcy. They could meet together again, didn't have to mask up even on the field. Now, those that did it or weren't fully vaccinated continued their testing, continued to have to be, separated during pre-games and that sort of thing. So this year was a lot better kind of working back to that normalcy, but we had to still be on high alert. And as you saw in our bowl season, COVID can still have impact, and it did. And so we're very hopeful that, we've got these great learnings coming out of COVID, but that maybe we turn the corner. But who knows? I mean, we go from one variant to the next, and we think we're beyond it, but then we find out maybe we're not. So this is something we'll prepare to live with in the long term. And if it does back up and ease off, then my hope is that we've taken those skills that we learned in a pandemic world, namely being able to be virtual and everything, overlay that with face-to-face, and we're all better off for that.
Let's hope for sure. I'm curious and this would maybe more apply to the officials that were in the Pac-12 or and say the Big Ten, those without fans, last year compared to this previous season. Did you notice much of a difference in terms of how they handled things? Because it might have been a bit of a shock for some of them to go from a completely empty stadium and refereeing with a lot of eyeballs on television to having those fans back in the stands, kind of on top of you with every call.
I think, even though, is it nice to work a game with no fans booing or whatever? But I mean, the reality is the energy in the stadiums with those fans back, and what it does to just enhance the experience of the game. We were glad, just like the players, to have those fans back. And so, this is one of those things that, it's just part of, as you evolve as an official and work, into higher games that you just get used to, and just kind of becomes, the background. And so, but it was so noticeable. We tried to do things, the first year in the pandemic, if you remember, we went to an electronic whistle, the thought, at that time, boy, an official going to their mouth, 100 plus times a game, probably not a good idea. But even in empty stadiums or 20% full stadiums, we just really never could get the electronic whistle to really have the output and what we needed. So, we tried a lot of things, but I'm going to tell you, our officials appreciate being back to a more normal environment with crowds and crowd noise. And that brings up one other issue that's a topic in our game now. And it's around stemming, shifting by the defensive line, making sounds that sound like the offense. And even, we've not allowed, it's a disconcerting signal now if the defense claps, if the offense is using that as part of that. So as we got back into fans, now we get back into a lot of football issues that we've got to talk about and continue to work to try to solve those type issues.
Welcome return, and a lot on the plate of Steve Shaw, the National Coordinator of Officials. Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Good to be with you, Bryan.